Welcome and good evening, everyone. I'm Ray Offenheiser, a faculty fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies and director of the Pulte Institute for Global Development here at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our event this evening entitled How to Fight Inequality and Why the Fight Needs You. This event is part of the University of Notre Dame's annual Walk the Walk Week, a week in which we collectively pause to reflect and engage on important issues of social injustice. We conclude this week with the annual Human Development Conference organized and led by some of our student panelists this evening. The focus of the event this evening is inequality. Along with climate change, growing inequality is one of the most daunting global challenges of our time. While wealth, income, and welfare gaps were wide before the COVID pandemic, COVID has dramatically widened these gaps and undermined important global advances we've made in poverty alleviation over the last decades. While families across the globe have lost loved ones, homes, jobs, their health, stock markets have boomed, and billionaires have increased their wealth by more than 20%. Such extreme concentrations of wealth are a threat to the lives and livelihoods of millions, to economic growth, to democratic governance, and to national and international security. And despite a recognition of this threat by governments signing on to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, nothing of consequence has been done to address this problem. Our event this evening is intended to explore the question, what is the challenge posed by accelerating inequality, and why is it so hard to resolve? Our event this evening is presented by the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, with co-sponsorship by the Pulte Institute for Global Development and the Higgins Labor Program of the Center for Social Concerns. I now want to take the opportunity to introduce our panelists and to get our discussion underway. We're joined this evening from Rome by my very good friend and colleague, Ben Phillips. Ben is a civil society activist, writer, and co-founder of the Fight Inequality Alliance, a global network of civil society organizations united in a struggle to address global inequality. Ben is a former Kellogg Institute Hewlett Fellow for Public Policy, who was resident on campus in the spring of 2019. And Ben recently published a book, which he worked on while resident at the Kellogg Institute, entitled How to Fight Inequality and Why That Fight Needs You. Joining Ben this evening, we've got four student panelists. Ann Foley, class of 22, is a junior anthropology and global affairs major, a Kellogg International Scholar. Is currently conducting research both on the role of religiosity in post-disaster resiliency in Haiti and on the quality of healthcare services in India. Most importantly, Annie is the co-chair of this year's Human Development Conference, which will be taking place at the end of this week, and we hope you will maybe look onto the Kellogg site and try to join panels of that conference as well. Maddie Oborg, class of 21, is a senior studying environmental sciences and sustainability. Matt plays leadership roles with the Center for Social Concerns and the Balfour Hesburgh Scholars Program, as well as the Department of Biological Sciences Senior Leadership Committee. He also volunteers as a college advisor for high-achieving, low-income high school students and serves also as vice president for the Multicultural Pre-Med Society. Jeff Musema, class of 21, is a senior double majoring in neuroscience and economics. Jeff is president of the Multicultural Pre-Medical Society, president of Wabruda, a campus group promoting discussion and reflection among African-American students, and is a STEM academic coordinator for the Balfour Hesburgh Scholars Program. Anastasia Reisinger, class of 21, is a senior majoring in international economics and peace studies. Anastasia has been actively engaged with the Center for Social Concerns since her freshman year, participating in the Migrant Experiences Seminar, which featured time spent among the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Immokalee, Florida. She is also a Reverend Don McNeil CSC Leadership Fellow and active in the Center for Social Concerns Higgins Labor Program, where she's conducting research on just wages. And finally, our moderator this evening is Ms. Holly Rivers. Holly is Associate Director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, where she develops and administers all the undergraduate programs. Special thanks go to Holly this evening for connecting our student panelists to the work of Ben Phillips. So now, without further ado, I want to turn this evening's program over to our guest, Ben Phillips, who will begin the discussion and lead on into the panel. Ben, thanks. Delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Ray. Thank you. And thanks for having me. Can you all hear me? Nod if you can hear. Brilliant. So the first thing to say is it's wonderful to be back, if only virtually. And the second thing to say is that this is not a lecture. This is a how-to. Sometimes people ask me what interests me about inequality. But the thing is that inequality is not a subject that interests me. It's an indignity to fight against. When I was at Notre Dame as a visiting fellow, I was inspired that there is something at Notre Dame that's even more important than being the smartest person in class. And that is football. No, it's not football. It's service. It's learning in service. Inequality is rising. Most of the world's population have been living for the past few decades in countries where inequality is rising. And since the COVID crisis, everyone in the world has been living in a country where inequality is rising. Just one statistic, the ILO says that workers have lost across the world $3.7 trillion in wages because of the COVID crisis. And yet, Forbes magazine says that the world's billionaires have gained $3.9 trillion. Inequality, as Ray pointed out, holds back progress on all sorts of fronts. And most people in most countries say that inequality is too high, and yet it keeps rising. So how do we beat it? For my book, How to Fight Inequality, I went back and I looked at 150 years of history across the whole world at how, at different times and places, inequality had been beaten. Now, I've only got 10 minutes with you, so I can't share the whole book and the whole rest of the world, but luckily it's available today on the website of this event at 40% off. But I'm just going to touch on the US. So between the 1930s to the 1970s, the US saw serious reductions in inequality between classes, genders, and races. How? It's a story that's often told in terms of presidents. It's told in terms of FDR's boldness or JFK's idealism. But when you look at the story behind the story, it's a story of mass movements. Inequality was never given, tackling inequality was never given, even by the best leaders. It was always won. As Lyndon B. Johnson said to Martin Luther King, I know what I have to do, but you have to make me do it. A combination of pressures from below, from trade unions, from civil society organizations, from Black movements, from churches, from other progressive groups, were the key. In the Venn diagram of those movements, you'll find people like Philip Randolph, who was a Black trade union organizer, who pressured both the FDR government and later on the Kennedy Johnson governments. Without that pressure, those presidents would not have been the reforming, transforming ones that we remember today. And interestingly, that progress on tackling inequality continued under Republican and Democratic governments. And yet by the time we get to the 1990s and beyond, neither Democrat nor Republican governments are reducing inequality. One part of the answer seems to be what's called trade union density. That's just a fancy word for how many people belong to a trade union. In short, the more people who belong to a union, the more inequality goes down, not just in a company, but in a country. The same pattern we see in the UK and France and elsewhere. And it's just for this reason. Ordinary people are never powerful alone. They're only ever powerful together. What are the tips that history seems to give us about how inequality can be tackled? The first is to be willing to be seen as trouble. Now, sometimes today, people will say, for example, why can't Black Lives Matter be more like Martin Luther King? And yet, in 1966, 63% of Americans said that Martin Luther King was divisive. The great civil rights leader John Lewis talked about good trouble. When I went back and I looked at the movements across the world in any country over the past 150 years that had been successful in reducing inequality, every single one of them was criticized at the outset. The suffragettes, who only asked that women have the vote, were criticized as trouble by the New York Times. The second lesson seems to be to build power together, to build power collectively, to form groups, and then to help those groups form groups of groups. Today, the Reverend William Barber talks about fusion coalitions. The third lesson is the importance of crafting a narrative, of building a story. It's not enough simply to list policies. We have to create an image, a vision of the society that we want to build. And that will often involve music and art as much as it will involve policy papers. The great organizer Joe Hill pointed out that a pamphlet, however well written, will only be read once and then put away, whereas a song will be learnt by heart and sung over and over again. Now, is this a guaranteed recipe for success? No, it's not. There's a beautiful slogan in Latin America. I love this slogan. It goes, the people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. Now, sadly, it's not true. The people united are often defeated, but what is true is this. The people disunited are always defeated. So though resistance doesn't always work, acceptance always doesn't work. This isn't a guaranteed recipe for success, but it does seem, when I look back at the historical record, to be the only thing that has ever delivered sustainable reductions in inequality in any country, in any society. Cesar Chavez, who led Latino and other farm workers in California, said this: we don't need perfect political systems. Indeed, perfect political systems will never come. What we need is perfect participation. And what he meant was that it's only through our own action, through togetherness, through pushing up, that we ever succeed in reducing inequality. Hope isn't above you, it's around you. That's why today we have Annie and Stasia and Jeff and Matty. I'm worried though. I'm worried that you'll hear them and you'll say, wow, they're brilliant. I'll never be like them. Now, they are brilliant, but they're not that brilliant. And what I mean by this is this. There isn't something that they have, something innate that they have, that you can't ever have. They just stepped up. And there's something even more important, which is that if you see them, hear them, and think, wow, those four will change the world, but I can't, then they will fail. They can't do it without you. So there isn't an audience and there aren't spectators. You're not here to applaud, you're here to be recruited. When I was at Notre Dame, I took a plane down to Atlanta. I was on a pilgrimage to see the memory, the history of my childhood hero, Martin Luther King. But when I got to Atlanta, I didn't see history, I saw the present tense. I met Martin Luther King's little daughter, Bernice, except she's not so little anymore. She's now Reverend Dr. Bernice King, a professor of theology and an activist and organizer. And what she told me was that the work continues. Don't stop. Don't stop. Bernice and I became great friends, and she gave me perhaps the greatest honor I've been given, which was to speak at this year's King Memorial Remembrance. And the thing was that it wasn't just a remembrance. It was planning. It was about now. Now, in the hallways of Notre Dame is a beautiful picture. And that picture is of Father Hesburgh and of Martin Luther King. They're not just holding hands. They're not just smiling and being friends. They're causing trouble. They're rebelling. They're building power. And they're crafting a new story. And that story was never a story of a few great men, was never a story of one or two inspirational leaders, but was always a story of mass organizing. And it's not a story consigned to the past. It's a guide for the present, for how we win our future. So the history lesson is, in a way, quite frightening, because the history lesson says this: if you don't like the way things are, the only person that you can rely on is you and your friends and others. Some young people in Kenya said to me once, "There's no justice, Ben, just us." That can seem bleak, but just us, organized, is the most powerful force that we have. We are the people we've been waiting for. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ben, and it's a privilege to be able to follow that up and to share my experience about organizing to address inequality in the Notre Dame community and beyond, and also, as Ben said, to talk about how you too can get involved in that. So as Mr. Offenheiser said, again, I'm Annie. I'm a junior studying anthropology and global affairs. But most importantly, I'm the co-chair of this year's Human Development Conference alongside senior Emily Mira. The Human Development Conference is the only student-run conference in the United States that focuses on interdisciplinary undergraduate research on topics that are related to global development. In fact, the conference is coming up this weekend on Saturday and is preceded by a keynote address by Acumen CEO Jacqueline Novogratz on Friday. We're thrilled to welcome Ms. Novogratz as our keynote speaker because her pioneering work with Acumen really embodies the mission of the conference, which of course is deeply tied to the mission of Notre Dame, to direct knowledge in service of the greater good. Every year, we highlight field research that students have conducted on topics ranging from food security to access to education to access to healthcare. But often, and this is something that I've experienced myself, we struggle to understand the purpose of our research. How are we as undergrads contributing to the greater good when many of us, most of us, do not yet have the tools to publicize our research? How can we be sure that our field experiences are not just beneficial to ourselves, but to the communities that welcome us into their lives? I'm constantly asking myself these questions. When I lived in India the summer after my freshman year, I conducted exploratory research on antenatal care. I constantly caught myself feeling out of place. What was I doing to address the inequality in access to healthcare that I witnessed? Was I contributing to the structures of inequality myself as an American outside of the system? As co-chair of the Human Development Conference this year, I'm trying my best to answer these questions. The whole goal of our conference is to celebrate undergrads who have both the courage to conduct field research and the humility to understand that their research is only the beginning. The theme of our conference this year is "The Future is Now: Innovative Responses to Global Adversity." We believe that it's never too early to start contributing to the colossal effort to reduce inequality and promote human dignity for all. We believe that the time is now, yes, even during COVID, especially during COVID, to start asking ourselves how we can use our interests and talents to fill the gaps in knowledge that are preventing people from living their best lives. As undergraduates, we are already building a community of students who are committed to directing research towards the common good. While it may seem so now, our field experiences are not just for our own intellectual benefit. Rather, they're opportunities to build the skill sets and the connections that are so vital to exposing structures of inequality, like the ones I witnessed in India, preventing rural women from accessing antenatal care that they so needed. I would encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about our research community and the work we've been able to do to consider joining us on Friday and Saturday for our keynote address and conference. I will put the links in the chat. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. That was awesome, Annie. I'll be sure to tune in Friday and Saturday to the Human Development Conference. That sounds great. So yeah, I'm Stacia. I'm a senior majoring in international economics and peace studies. And I really found the intersection of those two fields with my work with the Higgins Labor Program. I've served since my junior year as a research assistant with the Just Wage Initiative, which is an interdisciplinary working group of scholars who really try to answer the qualitative questions behind what makes up a just wage. So there's a framework of 7 different indicators and criterion, and it's an amazing, we're having a forum for it at the moment right now. So if you are interested in tuning in, that's definitely something you should look into. But what I'm here to highlight today is actually a different movement outside of the University of Notre Dame that I've had the privilege as a student to be exposed to. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which I've worked with both in the capacity as a student, as was mentioned in the introduction, through the social concern seminars, and also through my role as a research assistant with the Higgins Labor Program. So this is a coalition of farm workers based out of Immokalee, Florida, who recognized the historic marginalization of farm workers in the United States. There are very few legal protections for this group of individuals. So they kind of got together and said, well, how can we garner power when the power for workers, which typically comes from these legal institutions, just does not exist? So by gathering together and looking for solutions to this issue, they kind of thought, okay, well, if we can't force change from our employers, let's go directly to the consumer. So they devised this program entitled the Fair Foods Program that basically goes directly to the consumers and says, as a consumer, you have a responsibility to consume responsibly and ethically and in a way that promotes the civil rights of everyone involved. So this Fair Foods Program asks different consumers and businesses that to do with food to only buy their tomatoes from Fair Foods certified farms. And businesses that have signed on to this program include Walmart, Yum Foods, which encompasses KFC and Taco Bell, I believe Whole Foods, McDonald's, so huge businesses, and all from this one relatively small group of farm workers in a small town in rural Florida. And a really cool thing about this movement is that Notre Dame has a historic connection to it as well. When they were just at the beginning of their campaign, one of the first businesses and consumers that they targeted was Taco Bell. And at the time, Notre Dame's football team had a connection to Taco Bell. And a group of students, actually, I believe it didn't have any connection to administration. I think it was a student-run movement that led protests. There was a fast outside La Fortune Student Center asking the football team to cut its contract with Taco Bell until it agreed to sign on to this Fair Foods program. So it was called Boot the Bell was the movement, and it ended up as part of a larger context of protest movements, having a huge impact, and ultimately was one of the many factors that led to Taco Bell signing on to this really important movement that has now been lauded by the UN as a really seminal movement for workers' rights. So I think that this is a great story because, first of all, it is a movement that is really led by those who are experiencing the problem that they're looking for a solution for. I think that's really important. And it leads to the question, what can I, as a student who's not a marginalized worker, do to support these individuals? I think the biggest lesson I've learned through my work with the Higgins Labor Program is that as a student, using my social power to amplify the voices and stories of those for whom I would love to advocate is the most important thing I can do. There's nothing I can do to try and fix someone else's problem, but I can be supportive of the solutions that they devise. And I think that as students, we all have a lot of power in that respect. So I'm kind of nearing the end of my time, but I just want to really impress upon all students, as Ben was saying, this is within everyone's power. There's nothing like special about me that led me to have this one individual experience. This is something that is accessible to all students. And so I just want to leave you with that. And I'm very honored to be amongst these other students who are here working to advocate for others, as I would love to encourage all of you to do.
Yes, I completely echo what Seja was saying, and I'm very fortunate to be here. As I said earlier, I'm Jeff Musema, president of Bruta and the Multicultural Premier Society, and I'll speak a little bit about the work that Maddie and I did during the summer with administration and essentially the outcomes of those efforts. So during the spring of 2020, we faced the passing of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, and the action that followed in regards to the Black Lives Matter movement and corresponding social justice movements were a culmination of the grief and desire for beneficial change that laid upon the hearts of the families of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and the countless others within America who were coping with the untimely passing of their loved ones due to the ruthless hand of racism and police brutality. Shortly after their passings, Notre Dame organized a Prayer for Unity Walk for Justice event, and I was fortunate to speak at that event. And I prepared an essay alongside Maddie titled Change That Transcends Convenience. And I'd like to read a portion of that essay that reminded me that remained true throughout our pursuit of beneficial change. In the essay, I said that we hope that our efforts are not merely due to the convenience and sensationalism of the moment, as the magnitude of the struggles that Black and African American men and women face within the Notre Dame community and our nation as a whole are often diminished once the moment passes. And the message that I hope to get across in that essay were echoed in the sentiments personally expressed by Father Jenkins and Reverend Pete McCormick after the event to continue the conversation with a focus on discussing the issues at hand and formulating beneficial solutions throughout the summer. And the Walbruda's board echoed this sentiment, and we ultimately organized the first meeting with over 70 people in attendance, including high-ranking members of administration, Walbruda alumni, and current members of Walbruda. And this led to subsequent conversations with administrators and other student leaders of the respective Black and African American student organizations. And ultimately, we formed 4 working groups consisting of members of administration and student leaders who carried on the work throughout the summer. And those groups were campus policing, health and well-being, professors, faculty, and staff, and student life. As we entered into the fall semester, a myriad of other students expressed their desire to contribute to our cause, and I'm truly grateful for that. I realized that student involvement wasn't based on our skin color or restricted to the Black or African American community, because we were all fueled by the collective interest in having a true Notre Dame experience that isn't dictated by one's skin color or the ethnicity that they claim. And student leaders worked closely to resolve microaggressions and blatant displays of racism that they face or their peers face on campus, because ultimately we just wanted Notre Dame to be a home for all. And my appreciation and thanks to the members of administration that have allowed us to not only continue the conversation, but work closely with them towards beneficial solutions has been well documented. But as with any passionate initiative, the fuel that fires the passion does begin to wane, and the fugitive smoke cleared, and we realized there were a few hurdles that we needed to overcome in order to engender long-lasting change, which I believe Maddie can speak upon next.
All right, thanks, Jeff, and thank you to the other panelists and some of the amazing work that they've been able to do. So Jeff mentioned we've worked together in a lot of the work that he discussed. Excuse me, and we've been able to reflect on our triumphs and successes, but also how not everything has gone just as we've envisioned it. So, for example, as students really continue to be very active towards the goals and efforts that Jeff had just discussed, we found that some of the university leaders and administrators that we worked with had to direct their efforts more towards COVID and the COVID situation at the university, which of course is totally understandable. Students' health needs to really be paramount. But what that often did was leave initiatives on the table that were really important and that really required all stakeholders to participate. And another thing that we've been able to reflect on is the difference between mobilizing and organizing and how that idea came into the work that we did together. And so what I guess I would define a part of that difference to be is the idea of permanence. So organizing really needs to focus on longevity, continued participation, and steadfastness in order to really be effective. And one of the reasons why that can often be difficult, especially today, is because social media is one of the most important tools for organization. And social media is a system. That's built for impermanence. It's built to satisfy instant gratifications and that focus that we have in our modern day. And so one thing that you have to do as an organizer is to really figure out how you're going to utilize the tools and systems that you have at your disposal, such as social media, in order to engender steadfastness and longevity and those things that make organizing really, really, really effective. And probably one of the most significant historical examples of organizing and organization is the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted, I believe, 381 days. It lasted over a year, which was an amazing feat in organization. And it's really one of the things that allowed me and allowed Jeff to be on this panel today. But of course, I can't just focus on some of our difficulties, but we also had some major triumphs. And one of those that I think as a collective was really developing and pushing the narrative and are really getting our voice and our story across. For example, specifically, I talked about an instance I had experienced where I was racially profiled by a Notre Dame police officer during my freshman year. And when I told this story to the police chief, Carrie K. Shibata, who I'm very, very thankful for. She worked directly with us continuously throughout the last semester to hold unity summits, bringing police officers and students together. The police department committed to and expressed their equity in policing through a report, and they really cared. Another example is when students of color described how they had no one to turn to in comfort and in confidentiality when their mental health was suffering in a campus where you can often feel isolated and combat struggles of microaggressions and racism. The University Health Center and the University Counseling Center came together and established student fellowships. They also hired counselors of color for students to turn to, and they really listened and they really cared as well. And so now, Jeff mentioned this a little bit earlier. We're continuing on our work. We're remaining energized and steadfast as much as we can. And one of these ways is through the Multicultural Student Insight Committee, which although has changed in the way that we originally organized it, we really learned about the importance of flexibility in organizing as well, and how that allows us to ensure that not only our best interests and ideas are being promoted, but also that the best interests and the best outcomes for our communities are being satisfied. Thank you.
So I want to thank Ben and Annie, Stacia, Jeff, and Maddie. And I have to say, as someone who works at the university, it's also really exciting to hear what's going on, because we don't always know what you're doing. And so just having you here and sharing your stories and letting us know what you're doing is, one, inspiring for the rest of us, and it's really informative for the rest of us, because a lot of times we don't even know what you're doing. So thank you all for just your willingness to share with us. You don't want to hear from me, so my role really is to get as many questions from our audience as possible so our panelists can share more. And so what I'd like to do, if we can, is take a few questions from the audience, maybe take a few at a time, so that we really can get as many of you and get as many questions as possible in the remaining time that we have. And so if you can raise your virtual hand, that would be great, to let us know you're out there and to let us know that you have questions. And like I said, I'd be happy to call on you. And otherwise, I'm going to sing in the meantime, and I don't think anybody wants that. So who has a question out there that we can go ahead and take? And if we're waiting for a question while you're trying to get your thoughts together, then I can go ahead and give one. Several people actually submitted questions from when they registered. And so maybe I'll start with one from an alum, from David Balkin, who has asked us, how is equality possible without universal health care? Poor, underrepresented minorities have less prenatal health care, have higher mother death rates during delivery, and lower birth weight babies, etc. So the question is really, how do we think about this, and how do we have it possible when there is no universal health care? And if one of our panelists or a few of our panelists would like to take that question, that would be great.
Should we gather a few, Holly? Gather a couple more and then...
We can indeed. I don't have any from the audience right now, so I can just ask. Oh, wait, I think I do have one, but I can't see who it is. Can someone help me out? Dan Graff, thank you. Would you, if you want to ask a question as well?
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now? Thanks, Holly. Yeah. Thanks to Ben and the students for this great panel. Really enjoying it. So I have a question for Ben, but for the students as well, and that's sort of the COVID moment. Ben raised the statistic about the lost wages globally compared to the trillions gained by billionaires during this time. So there's a threat that inequality is, growing worse right now. So I'm wondering where might we see signs of hope in the COVID moment for new organizing and innovations happening? Wonder if any of the panelists can speak to that.
That's wonderful. And those two really go together so well. So here's the thing about crises, is you can think of them a bit like heat. So before a crisis, social structures is a bit like metal or glass in a workshop. And then the crisis becomes like heat. Suddenly, change is possible. And it's not a coincidence that the FDR New Deal government followed the 1929 Wall Street crash. So that horrendous economic depression did, in a more positive sense, create an enabling opportunity for perhaps the most reformist administration that the US has ever had. But here's the other thing, that heat, that could go either way. So the 1929 Wall Street crash leads in the US to the most progressive government the US has ever had. Well, you know what the 1929 crash led to in Germany, in Austria, in Italy, in Central Europe? Fascism. So there's no guarantee that any crisis is a positive opportunity. It's just an opportunity. Things are a bit more in flux. So perhaps now, those who are working, for example, for universal healthcare, for a higher minimum wage, for fairer taxation that takes more from those at the top, have a better chance than they've had in decades. But so too, some of the most vicious and dangerous forces also have a better chance than they've had in decades. So it's really, really in contention. A positive thing around COVID and health has been a really interesting change in the conversation. Almost every politician now, recognizing that in a pandemic, my illness is your illness, there isn't a competition, say that access to COVID medicine should be free, right? But by the same logic, why isn't access to insulin free? Why isn't access to cancer treatment free? Why isn't access to mental health care free? So the logical case has been surrendered around the value of a universal healthcare system. It's interesting when you compare other industrialized countries and you look at maternal mortality is just a posh word for how many mums die giving birth. The US is double any other industrialized country. And yet the amount of money you spend on healthcare is actually higher. So your system means twice as many mums die than should have to. So there's a chance with this moment. I think the pessimists who say, well, the problem is now there's no money, get it wrong, because these great reforms do often happen in times of crisis. But I don't think you can expect it to be given. I don't think that in order to understand the answer to the question, will you get universal healthcare, what you need to do is study the biographies of everyone in office. I think what you need to do is organize.
Yeah, I'll also speak to that a little bit. The theme of the Human Development Conference is innovative responses to global adversity. The future is now. And so I can speak from the student perspective that students at Notre Dame and across the country that we've invited to come to this conference to share their research recognize that now is a crucial time in history to see where there are gaps in knowledge and how we can use our interests and talents to fill them. And our keynote speaker, Jacqueline Novogratz, I don't want to speak too much for her or give away too much about what she's going to speak about on Friday, but her business, Acumen, pioneered the sector of impact investing. And during the pandemic, they've continued to invest in social enterprises across the world, particularly in South Asia, that are using COVID-19 as a time to expand their services and to reach populations that they didn't reach before. And so her business is just one example. And she will speak more about that on Friday. So again, I would love to have all of you come and hear about how even sectors that we don't traditionally consider in global development can also partake in responding to global adversity.
Do any of our panelists, anyone else want to take one of those questions? Okay, then I believe that we have a question from the audience from Tieho. So if you would like to speak, then feel free.
Hello. So I'm actually calling in from the Kingdom of Lesotho. I'm a Mandela Washington Fellow from 2018. And I'd just like to pass a comment to Jeff and Maddie. I think that, as far as the Black community is concerned, sometimes, at least in my experience, and this is a comment, not a question, My experience is that they've delegated too much to the government. Okay, they've disempowered themselves, at least in how they see themselves. So there's a lot of personal development that still needs to take place. All of the marches are good, and everything that has to be done in terms of rising up and standing up for tough things that are happening and going out in the streets and marching. That's good, but there's a lot of personal development that still needs to be done. I mean, simple things like self-care, eating well, those are very important things to communicate. And then last one is, if you think about the US and how the US came into existence, they left the mothership, which was old Europe, right? And if you think about guys today who are changing the game, like Elon Musk, for example, he was rejected countless times by institutions like NASA, but he broke away and did his own thing. So I would say you as young leaders in the Black community need to think about ways in which the Black community can be self-sufficient. And you need to find the smartest people, okay? And let those people share the knowledge. Build online platforms, find the best books of people who are advocating for certain systems that can work in Black communities. And just the last point, the Jews have done the same thing in finance, small group, but they were able to succeed because they were self-sufficient. Thank you.
Before I take another question, does anyone want to comment on that? Thank you, Tieho.
Yes, I can add a comment to that. Could you remind me what his name was again? I couldn't see his face.
Tieho, which I'm pronouncing Tieho, but maybe wrong.
Yeah, I think I agree with part of your sentiment. It does begin within the Black community, and as any social justice effort would, you have to really empower your own community first before you reach out to other communities and asking them for hand or upliftment, because self-sufficiency is of utmost importance. I don't think that it needs to be the smartest people or the ones that are quote unquote like the most qualified just based off the resume. Like as Ben mentioned in the beginning, we are all just regular people fighting for an extraordinary thing, and I think we can all work together towards a shared interest and use our interests collectively towards beneficial solutions. But I do agree that it does begin within your own community before asking other communities to help you.
Yeah, and I definitely second the things that Jeff had to input. And I also think it's important to consider that part of what the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, is fighting for is systematic change that will also promote self-sufficiency and promote empowerment. For example, when you're thinking about nutritional choices or something as small as nutritional choices, there are systematic problems that influence those choices being made, and so that's another consideration that needs to happen, and that's a part of the movement and part of the work that's trying to be done. So it's not really you almost have to focus on multiple things, multiple causal things at a time, and it's a little bit difficult to solely jump to being self-sufficient, and we really have to think about how this process can work and how it involves every single person as well.
Thank you. We'd like to take more questions from the audience, but in the meantime, I'm going to take a question that was given to us from one of our graduate students, from Jack Consolini. And that question is, what is the best way for a young man to support the fight against inequality? What is the best way to make changes to community or governmental laws which go against inequality? And how can I support the passage of laws which support equality? How do I better engage people who don't want to have a conversation about inequality and race and get them to understand why things like affirmative action and the feminist movement are important and necessary? And I'm going to put that one out there to the panelists.
Yeah, hi. One of the things that I've kind of learned in studying past labor movements is that one of the most effective ways of helping engage other people's interest is by pointing out the self-interest that they have in any given situation. It's a little bit more difficult to understand why, for instance, feminism, as you invoked, why feminism matters if I think that this is just a movement that's for, white women or women who are relatively privileged and things like that. But when you can point out how feminism impacts every individual, like an intersectional swath of women, men, in every individual, then I think that that's really where you can get the most investment from people. And obviously, like in an ideal world, other people's interests are enough, but a lot of times you have to invoke these higher ideas of like self-interest, as well as justice and equality. So I think that's one element of it. I would love to hear what everybody else has to say on that point as well.
I think that's a lovely. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. So another point that I want to add to what Stasia was saying is how important it is to be transparent and honest, and that transparency needs to come between both parties, the person who's trying to talk about inequality and the person who's trying to learn about inequality, because one of the most impactful things is a story, and a story that's built out of honesty. Sometimes the hard numbers and the statistics aren't as convincing as you would think they are. But what is really impactful and almost always is impactful is emotion, and that's something that any person can hopefully connect to.
We have another question from Professor Mahan Mirza, so I'm going to leave it to him.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? I
Yeah.
think I might be echoing. I'm in the hall. Thank you very much. This was really fantastic. And, I want to go back to two things. One, the inequality statistics, the 3.5 trillion loss for most workers, and then the 3.5 trillion gain for billionaires in the pandemic. I mean, that just seems grotesque. And so how do we get to a better place? I mean, if we talk about taxing the rich or controlling profits, all of a sudden people start throwing out labels like socialism. Even with medical care, I completely follow the logic that if people are dying from COVID and you suddenly think it's important to save their lives from COVID, why would you let them die from any other disease just because they don't have the resources? I mean, that makes perfect sense. But we're back to like socialism. And so how do we get away from these kinds of labels? Is our politics messed up? I mean, that's one question. And then on the issue of moms dying from pregnancy-related causes, and it being more here in the United States than elsewhere, I'm looking at the CDC website, and it says Black, American Indian, and Alaskan Native women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women, and above 30, it's up to 5 times. So. When we're looking at these statistics, there's a second-order disparity on race. So the problems of inequality are layered. I wonder if you could say something about that as well.
Yeah, I really like the point you made about the double layer. There were some numbers that came out recent in the US about massive job losses, and then somebody did the details on them, and they said actually all these job losses are women, and then another person did the numbers on them and said actually all these job losses are Black women. So when you look kind of under the hood of America, you always find, and this is common across other countries too, but you always find that there's a class, a race, a gender, and other dimensions to the different forms of inequality. But at the same time, nobody's really winning. So I think there's a brilliant book called Dying for Whiteness, which talks about the social costs for the average white person of the project of racism in the States and how it fails them. When people buy into an idea that the biggest threat to them is people who love different or look different or pray different, or then they often buy into a whole load of agendas that actually end up profiting only the very richest people. So if you buy into the welfare queen narrative, and because of that, you rejected having a social safety net that kept you above water, then come a crisis like the Texas energy crisis right now, when people get $10,000 bills or a fear of freezing to death, and you see who it was working for. It works for the people that fly off to Mexico when there's trouble. So there's the impact has been particularly on Black people, but it's been on everybody. If you look at prison rates, for example, in the States, white Americans are in prison more than any other European country is, right? So Black Americans are more in prison than white Americans, but white Americans go to prison more than any country in Europe. So the burden of buying into a brutal hierarchy that throws people out is felt across. It doesn't actually work for anybody except for a few cream at the top. I think when you talked about, the fear that if you have fair taxation, if you have universal services, then people say, well, you're collapsing capitalism, you're collapsing the economy. A great friend of mine is a Danish-Iranian multimillionaire, and he always says that people say he's a self-made man, right? He came to Denmark as an immigrant. His mum was a cleaner. Now he's a multimillionaire. But he says, I'm not a self-made man. The welfare state made me. It wouldn't have been possible for someone like him without free crash care, without free quality education, and then without a qualified, talented workforce and great infrastructure in Denmark. Wouldn't have been possible for him to rise. And statistically, Scandinavian countries actually produce more innovators per head than America. They have longer. They've had longer and more sustained periods of economic growth. And the social mobility is higher. In fact, the American dream is more likely to be true for you if you're born in Copenhagen than if you're born in New York. So there's nothing really to be scared of, one president said, except fear itself. So we need a new work in storytelling. But in a fairer society, you'll also have, it's worth doing because it's worth doing, but you'd also have a better economy. Now, as to how you get there, I think that's where the long-term process of organizing matters. And that's why this statistic about union density seems to matter. It's interesting seeing what this administration says that they'll do. They say that they will tackle police brutality. Who organized for that? Black Lives Matter. They say that they'll raise the minimum wage, but who organized for that? The Fight for 15. So anytime you see a pledge that this administration is making, it's always in response to pressure from below. It's not been written in DC. It's been marched for and organized for and pushed for. So I think if there is to be progress of the type that you seek, it will only come with a little bit of a struggle. Some people imagine that elections are the moment when things end, but I think with this election, it might be the moment when things start.
And it looks like we have a question from Judy Benchar.
Hi, I wanted to respond to what you said, Ben. Thank you. It was excellent. And in response to your Dying for Whiteness, the book. So Heather McGhee has just come out with a book called The Sum of Us that sort of responds to the zero-sum thought that's been going on through the years with regards to racism. And the sum of us is what racism costs everyone and how we can prosper together. And she has done a lot of research and I highly recommend it. So that wasn't a question, but I wanted to thank all of our presenters. Thanks.
I'd also just like to put a question that was submitted early, but I think it would be useful for all of you. And the question is from a St. Mary's alum who says, as an elementary school teacher in a racially mixed school, African American, Latino, and white. How should I handle discussions about racial injustice and inequality when I know their parents all have different views and opinions on the topic? And I just add to that, we know that often people find it difficult to raise these topics. So how do you broach that? How do you think about that? I think that could be relevant to any of you. Or none, apparently.
Come on, students.
I can start if you guys want to follow me up. That works too. I think, I mean, honestly, Notre Dame can be a little bit of a difficult place to have these discussions. So I think we are somewhat uniquely, not uniquely, but we are qualified to answer this kind of question. And for me, it always is about coming from a fundamental orientation of respect. Because if you're respecting the person you're conversing with, it's going to be a lot better than if you're just devolving into insults about like different politicians and things like that. But then I also, you can have like that same respect without compromising your views. And I think that is like an important balance to make. And then finally, in like the specific discussions that this question addresses, as a white woman, I mean, this is ironic because I spoke up first, but I do think it's important to listen in conversations about racial justice, to listen more than you're speaking, because it's important to be involved in the conversation, but ultimately it's not about the white perspective. So if anybody else has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd really like to second Stacia's last point or second point in that it's okay to not know everything, but it's not okay to act and teach as if you do know everything, because that's where you provide misinformation, you really lead people astray. So always be open to learning and to listening, and also feel free to ask for help and to bring in people that have perspectives that you have never experienced, have stories that you really can't tell because you don't have them. Because there's one thing that I've learned really being at Notre Dame is that there's always somebody who knows something better than I do. And all it takes is asking the questions to find them. And that's really important, especially when you're talking about issues of racism and inequality that are directly related to people's experiences. And there's people that are likely willing to speak on those experiences, and you can't discount somebody's experiences, and those are and even if you're concerned about what parents who have different views say, the fact of the matter is that there is the truth, and that's not something that really can be denied.
Well, I believe we're at the end of our time, and I do want to say I really very much appreciate getting to hear all of your voices. So thank you so much for your willingness to share. To your point earlier, it's hard to get everyone to speak up. It can be difficult, and so thank you for being here and having that willingness to speak. And I'm going to hand this over to Ray again.
Great, thanks, Holly. And maybe, as Holly said, well, I'm afraid we're at the end of the hour. So we're going to have to close this evening's discussion. Along with Holly, I want to thank all of our panelists really for a great discussion. Ben, thanks so much for joining us late in the evening from Rome. We're really appreciative, and it's great to see you as always. Holly, thank you for moderating. And especially I want to thank all of our terrific student panelists, Annie, Maddie, Jeff, Anastasia. And thank you really, I think, very sincerely for sharing the stories of your work, which I think we've all appreciated, and particularly your vision for what effective organizing can look like among the students and in the wider world as you see it going forward. For all the folks that are viewing today, I hope you have enjoyed the discussion, learned something about inequality, and hopefully feel challenged to be part of a movement to create a more just and inclusive world. And as Ben likes to remind us, I love this quote: "There is just us. Without us, there is no justice." So maybe just think about that as you go on into your evening. For any of you who'd like to get a copy of Ben's book, How to Fight Inequality and Why the Fight Needs You, I'm pleased to let you know, as this screenshot will demonstrate, you can receive a 40% discount on the retail price of the book from the publisher's website today through March 6th using the code NDPOL. The publisher is Wiley Publishing. You can visit the Kellogg Institute website for more details at kellogg.nd.edu. Finally, I want to just reiterate what our panelists have been reminding us of. I want to invite you all to the Human Development Conference this week. I want to particularly encourage you to join Friday's keynote address by Janelin Novogratz, an old friend of mine, founder of Acumen, global innovator in impact investing, as well as joining the sessions on Saturday, which will be going on all day, and the schedule, I think, will be available to you on the Kellogg website at kellogg.nd.edu. So thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. We hope you enjoyed the program and that you'll join us for other Kellogg Institute programs in the future. Thanks to everybody, the panelists, and all the viewers, and stay safe and well. Good evening.